As the war in Ukraine, in Israel reaches its 6-month mark, everybody's looking to see what's going to be coming next. And there's been lots of interesting commentary coming out of Israel. Lots of tactical operations going on, some seemingly contradictory moves, and all kinds of analysis from both those who are pro Biden viewpoint and those who are pro Israel viewpoint. And those are also mixed up in both countries. So it's not like one or the other. There's plenty of people in the U.S. that seem to be more pro Israeli government than they do U.S., but we'll try to untangle some of that. And we have nobody better to do that than Jason Beardsley. I've been missing you, man. Glad to have you back on the show here. And I hope everything's going good. But we're really glad to have you back today.
No, it's always great to be with you. And of course, these are very strategically difficult, complex topics, but no better person to kind of talk it out with than the Colonel himself. So let's kick it off.
Let's do it. So we had a show earlier today where we kind of talked about the what has happened over the first 6 months of the war and what may happen next. But we want to look at something different, something more on the tactical. What's the very next thing that may be coming up here now? And that is over the weekend, there was a lot of seemingly contradictory signals coming from Israel. On the one hand, there was some headlines that said, hey, they are completely withdrawing from southern Gaza, and they're going to end the ground invasion. That's what the Israeli media was reporting. So that first, it really got my attention because I was like, wow, ending the ground invasion. Of course, I thought, well, this must be as a result of some of the Biden's pressures that they've been saying, hey, you're killing too many innocent people and you have to change some things, or we might, change some of our support. But then we started getting later on in the day that maybe that's not exactly what it meant. It didn't mean necessarily that they were leaving, because it turns out they seem to be getting ready for some additional operations. So just first of all, what did you think when you first heard that the first headline that they were completely withdrawing from the South?
Well, I think the language was pretty, let's call it clever. I think the withdrawal that they intended, as we see now, is a southern Gaza withdrawal. And it's an operation that's meant to do, let's call it a breather room or reset for ongoing or continual operations. So what looked like potentially a possible break or change in the situation was really a new phase in the war. And you've been in combat, so recognizing phase lines, and when you reset the forces, this is about clearing areas and then holding areas. And then, once you've got an area that's you've determined cleared, you can move to different areas. And so when you look at the map, this was all the way in the south, the Khan Younis camp, and now they have other intentions. Rafah, which is even further south, they think they've got what they wanted to surrounding sort of Gaza City in the northern strip. So it's really about kind of parsing the land into sort of bands, if you will, the southern band, the middle band, and the northern band.
And in fact, toward that end, we also had, I believe it was yesterday, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant actually pretty much said what you just did there.
החמאס הפסיק לתפקד כארגון צבאי ברחבי רצועת עזה. הכוחות יוצאים החוצה ונערכים למשימות ההמשך שלהם.
So that was a little bit clearer. Yes, we're getting ready for the next mission. We're not ending anything, which the headline made it sound like they were ending. So that made a lot in the U.S. happy, especially the Democrats, who are for a moment breathing a sigh of relief, because they want this off the table. They want this thing over so that they can get on to November and not have to worry about all this because of all the dying and whatever that the Israelis keep doing toward the Palestinians in their operations of these. But it doesn't look like that's coming. And in fact, a former General Hertling went on CNN to describe what it looks like that Biden may be putting pressure. And he seemed to be leaning toward maybe Netanyahu's side of this discussion.
They're going to see this delay or this retrofit and the pulling out of the 98th Division as a semi-victory, in my view. That's how terrorists will react. They will publicize this and message this, that yes, their strategy to bring the world and the United States to the fray of saying, Israel, stop your actions. It has gotten too rough. They will see that as a victory. So I believe we will see an eventual operations inside of Rafah. I don't know when that will be, but I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to delay that because he is getting such political pressure from the United States and from the international community.
But Jason, I number one, he is getting pressure from the White House, but as we're going to see in a minute, I'm not sure how strong that pressure is because it sure seems like Netanyahu remains in the driver's seat.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things contending here, and one of them is the on the ground situation. I'll take our audience back to places like Iraq and Mosul, or some of the areas that were very difficult to eradicate either Islamic State forces or Al Qaeda and affiliate forces. And when we took those cities, what you saw is a little bit of what you're seeing on the ground here, which is combatant forces surround a city. They attempt plans to go in. It's house to house type fighting. It's urban fighting. It's very dangerous. So on the precipice of that, it's helpful to get civilians evacuated, leave them corridors out. You've seen a little bit of that, but there's some problems in southern Gaza because you have to bring Egyptians on board, which means you've got to bring the Jordanians on board, the Qataris. There's a lot of external factors here, and make no mistake about it. I think a lot of people don't recognize how folks like the Jordanians and the Egyptians are actually leaning in on Netanyahu to completely complete the mission with Hamas. They can't say it out loud because there are people in their countries that wouldn't necessarily appreciate that. But the truth is, Hamas is a difficult thing to deal with. It's no different than what we saw on the ground again with beheadings and violence and butchery. So to do that well is extremely complex, and that's what Hertling is talking about. You're probably going to see more of these military operations, but the administration is in a tough position because while that's happening, no different than what the U.S. felt in places like Mosul, there are a lot of things that have to occur, and they're destructive, and people get hurt. And if you don't have a nice pressure valve that you can release, i.e., the corridor for evacuating citizens, it's not going to go well. So part of the delay is going to be how does the state of Israel manage that corridor or the evacuation of innocent persons? That's not easy to do here. So
yeah, and let's take a look. Let's camp out on that for just a second because there had been a lot. I mean, like for over a month, a lot of information out of the United States that said, "Hey, we want to see all of those civilians move to a safe place before you go in to Rafah." And you may remember there was a bunch of back and forths between Netanyahu who said, "Yeah, I'm listening to you, but we're going to do whatever we're going to do," and the U.S. said, "No, that really." You need to start doing something different because I'm not, they may imply that we might start holding something back if you go into Rafah without these provisions, without moving the people out of the way, because the casualties could spike to unendurable levels where the Western people, the U.S. voters, especially from Biden's perspective, may not support that. That kind of went on hold a little bit. And then a lot of it got lost when these World Central Kitchen workers were killed the other day, which is a huge issue that's sparked all kinds of anger, even among Democratic supporters of Biden. So now then I think they're kind of backed off from that a little bit, but it seems that they still are intent to going into Rafah. But the question is, can Israel afford to do that without getting these people out, and where would they send them?
So that's really a precise question, and the answer is a military operation conducted in urban terrain will be very damaging. And so the only answer is if you don't have an evacuation plan, you will, as you said, deal with escalating non-endurable casualties on the civilian front. So Israel, I think, now has to be faced with how do we do that? And again, that's going to be complex. It's about understanding how to move a population in a neighboring state. So that means that's diplomatic, external sort of treaty stuff. And you've got to have a good handle on how to filter. In other words, you've got to biometrically fingerprint. You've got to face scan those people. You've got to make sure there's a control mechanism because what Egypt is not going to do is they're not going to play host to what appears to be or could be potentially fraught with terrorists refugee camps, because that's why we're in this situation to begin with. All the neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, have had a difficult time hosting these populations. So what Israel is faced with is how do we do this? Nobody's done this well. And the complexity of that operation, again, is going to look a lot like what we've seen in places like Iraq or places like Afghanistan? How do you
Well,
survive
Jason,
the
man,
civilian?
I have physically conducted some of those biometric collection issues you're talking about there, and they are extremely time consuming. I mean, it would take months, I think, to get that many people that you're talking 1 million out of there. I handled some of the operations that I've observed. You're talking like 30, 40, 50 people at some of these places, maybe 100 or so in one of the operations, but nothing to this scale. And I don't know if the IDF even has that kind of capacity to process that many people. How would that work?
You're absolutely right. The problem is it's complex and it's not an easy operation. So I think one of the things you're seeing as the result of that is there's some delays. There's a lot of machinations that have to happen. So you saw the withdrawal from the southern portion. The part of what we're hearing is they are speaking amongst themselves. How do we then continue the operation to eradicate Hamas while surviving the civilian population? Now, what the administration is saying, our administration, President Biden, is we want details. We want to understand or feel confident that you're going to do this well. So far, though, and this is left to other people to decide. I'm not here to decide this, but so far, Israel has not shared that information and has not given the confidence to the administration. So what we're seeing as the public is the administration is pressing for more answers. We're probably not going to get those. This is a military operation. We don't know what the end result is going to look like, but we do know what Israel is attempting to do. They're going to attempt to eradicate the organizational military combatant wing of Hamas, which means intelligence operations, precision strike. You see that right now. It means the civilians that are moved out, some will be interrogated or questioned, some will be brought into safe positions, and then they'll have to find ways to move blocks of people at a time into camps or other places in Gaza. In other words, if you can move the Khan Younis people back into there, that relieves some pressure. If you can bring some people back into the middle band, that relieves other pressure. So not everybody, not all the 1.2 or 2.3 million people need to be moved into an external camp. They just have to know that where we're doing our next operation, i.e. Rafah, there is maneuverable room for armor and infantry and air to combine tactics to do what is a very, very tough military situation.
Now, let me ask you this from a practical perspective. So there is certainly compelling evidence that the rules of engagement for the Israeli Defense Forces in the combat zone, wherever they designate it, is if it moves, it dies. They don't distinguish between anyone. That's why I think that you saw them kill their own hostages, because they just saw a man moving and they shot him. That's why I think the alleged mistake that was made in killing those aid workers the other day with very pinpoint strikes were because they were moving in an area. Now, we can debate whether that was an error or whether that's actually part of their plan, but it seems like when they clear an area or they declare an area cleared, then anyone who's there is killed. So the big question is that they're just in the Rafah area. There's at least 300,000 military-age males there right now. Obviously, the most that ever was estimated of the total Hamas population was maybe 40,000 at the beginning, and they've allegedly killed like 2/3 of them already or wiped them out. So the question is that there could be 10, 12,000 Hamas fighters in that 300,000 men. How can anyone identify a Hamas target versus an innocent Palestinian man who just wants to take care of his family? How do they do that?
Yeah, so you and I are we members of our own armed forces. We saw these same questions in the places we fought on the ground, and we have the very same questions where soldiers in U.S. uniform are not really sure if that person running towards them, that's a 14-year-old male, is armed with lethal intent, or if he's armed with, let's call it non-lethal intent, or if he's not armed but he's got a suicide vest or something. We didn't know. And what we saw in Iraq, what we saw in Afghanistan, don't forget, as we withdrew from Afghanistan, we dropped ordnance on a van full of kids, innocent civilians. When you talk to our Department of Defense, the answer is it was a mistake. But there's not a lot of accountability. So what we're really seeing is a replay of this modern form of limited warfare where an armed combatant doesn't get organized by uniform and structure and line and block. So you're fighting an asymmetric war. That's what Israel is facing, which is why you're seeing the international community has a lot of concerns, rightly so, and Israel has a lot of concerns. They woke up on October 7th and dealt with what was essentially a terrorist, ambush raid. I'm not even sure how to quite calculate all that. So they're in a very tough position. But Americans have been there. We've been there. You've been there, Colonel Davis. And you know, like I do, when you're sitting up on a gun and somebody's moving and you don't actually know their intent, our rules of engagement were pretty restrictive at times. Sometimes they were a little looser. The commanders on the ground had to make tactical decisions based on, first and foremost, the safety of their soldiers, and secondly, the safety and defense of the people within their authority. So that's what you're going to see on the ground. The commanders on the ground are going to make mistakes. So I don't think anybody should be pretending about that. But at the end of the day, the state of Israel has a choice. You either live with a neighbor that is going to create terror incidents like this, or you go to war against an enemy. Now, the challenge with that is at the state level, there are some complexities, whether you look at the governing factors of Palestine and such. Our job as soldiers is to look at this and warn not just our leadership. Our leadership should be warned that when we get involved with these situations, the more we're entangled with it, the more complex it is. And we didn't answer these questions as a United States military on the ground. There were not one clean answer here. This was a range of answers over 20 years that changed per deployment. You'll remember that. So we have to be very careful. And that's why the United States, at the very best, should look first and foremost, the same thing as Israel, as the safety of our soldiers, same thing as Palestine, by the way, safety of our soldiers, safety of our interests first. And the United States interest lies squarely on the backs of our Department of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff to ensure that the men and women in the region are not under harm's way from threats that escalate from somebody else's war.
And it's you and I also saw this play out a lot on a smaller scale in comparison to this, but the reality is, because it is nearly impossible to distinguish those 10,000 from the 300,000 in there, that large numbers of innocent men are going to be killed in the process. And there's just, if they can't physically get them out of the way, there's no way around that. And of course, that's what we also saw, is that every time someone who wasn't a Hamas member is killed, then that just creates more enemies. So whatever you take out, you're going to end up getting worse. That's my frustration here, is that Israel is on a path here that not only can't succeed, it's more likely to create more instability than it did when they started shooting people in the first place.
Well, again, I'll take this back to a place like Bucha, prison camp in Iraq. You said it. We took a lot of military age male prisoners. We put them in detention for 7 days, or depending on the time, released them back into the environment. And next thing you know, they picked up arms. If they were innocent going in, they came out as fighters, right? So we've seen that problem.
Right.
And the challenge is then, the military challenge is, okay, we left Iraq without actually resolving that situation. We left Afghanistan in the same similar state. So the United States doesn't yet have, let's call it, demonstrated proven performance in this type of asymmetric warfare to really be able to, I would say, come up with the right solution for Israel. I'm not saying Israel is going to have the right solution. I just know that for the United States, this was tough. So how do we do it? We don't know the answer to that. We shouldn't be enviable of being in that position at all. But that's the beauty here, Colonel Davis, is we're not in that position. The United States has an obligation to protect our citizens, our national interest. And so what that means is the administration has to be very careful about over-aggrandizing how much we're involved in these type of conflicts, because it's not going to be easy, and the end result's not going to look much better than what we dealt with in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah. In fact, I think you could argue it'll look a lot worse, as is self-evident when you look at the video here. Let's shift gears here. So while some people are talking about going back into Rafah and all the challenges that come with, others in Israel are actually looking farther to the north, because it looks like that the interest of Israel. Well, let me back that up. The interest of the U.S., I think Biden definitely wants this thing over with. He wants it wrapped up because he doesn't want it on the table as he's trying to run for president. And there's all downside for him for this to continue on. But Netanyahu seems to be wanting to go, all right, first let's take care of that part. And then I think that there's evidence that they're looking to go north. They maybe even into into Lebanon, into Hezbollah, or possibly even, quote, taking care of Iran. And it's not idle information, because actually another one of the headlines, Gary, if you can throw that one up there here also in the last couple of days, It says that all Israel's eyes are on the northern border. After 6 months of war, they're looking up north. And that was reinforced by one of the senior Israeli Air Force generals who in February said this.
Dozens of aircraft that are now operating in southern Lebanon are only part of our capabilities. And once the order is given, my intention is that the dozens will turn into hundreds of aircraft that perform all missions within minutes of taking off over the skies of Lebanon. In the scenario of a war in Lebanon, I want to tell you the following. The word attack does not express what will actually happen. There will be massive and significant strikes. Hundreds of targets will be attacked at the same time, also in the depths of the country.
Now, listen, I think that from my perspective, when Israel attacked the Iranian general in the embassy in Syria, I think they crossed a huge red line that's going to extremely fire up the Iranian side and make it probable that they're going to do something, possibly within a day or two of now. We'll see how that plays out after Ramadan officially ends, I think, on Tuesday night, our time. But the issue is that some think that Israel was trying to prompt an attack because they want to go to war against Israel. And now that's just one that I played there for the Israeli side. There's lots of others, generals on the ground that have been talking about going into Hezbollah. Not that Hezbollah is going to attack them, but that Israel is going to attack into the north. The question is, whatever they end up doing down here in the south with Rafah, are they then going to be looking to go and actually, quote, take care of the issue in Lebanon?
This is always hard to listen to because these are very tough statements. And some of them may be posture. Some of them, as you said, may be very intent on delivering on their threat. But what we have to, I think, worry about, and this is where I think our leadership has to focus on, is if the Iranians or other forces that are malign interest forces are attacking United States shipping in the Red Sea, are attacking U.S. soldiers in Jordan, or attacking our bases in Syria and Iraq, what it leaves open is the disposition of our forces, irrespective of what happens between the nation states of Israel, Lebanon, and the governing authorities of Palestine. Those things, if we don't control them, which we do not, we can't account for them. And what that means is the likelihood of danger that is posing a risk to our forces increases. And that's where we as an audience and as Americans should be most animated, most concerned, is that we're leaving our forces in harm's way while this trigger, this sort of tension is potentially going to get broke in the Middle East and spill out into an escalating conflict. That should be our primary concern. Escalation is not good for Israel. It's not good for Lebanon. It's not good for Palestine, but it's definitely not good for the United States. So if the president running for election really wants to unencumber himself from those continued violent attacks against U.S. interests, vessels, again, soldiers, there's a way to do that. What I'm missing, Colonel Davis, is in this conversation, why have we not been discussing that component instead of worrying about, hey, maybe Israel does attack Lebanon? I think that could end up with some very disastrous results. We've seen it before, but in this case, why are we leaving ourselves exposed on flanks that don't need to be exposed? And if the answer is a very good one, in other words, if Pentagon can stand up and say, there are some really good reasons why we're placed here and here and here, and show the tactics and show voters in Wisconsin and Ohio and Iowa why it's the important thing to do to station a pocket of 200 U.S. soldiers in the desert surrounded by enemies, show us on paper why that works best for my American pocketbook, my border security, our sovereignty. I'll play along with you. But if you don't show that, then I think we have the right to call into question what's the disposition of the United States forces and why are we left vulnerable during this tense time between these parties that are unlikely to resolve their conflict anytime soon.
Well, that is, and that's one of the biggest issues I've got and have had from the outset, is that our troops, especially in Iraq and in Syria or in Jordan, are nothing but strategic vulnerability. As we've seen, we've already lost 3 of them. We've been complaining about that for a long time now, and 3 are already been killed. Now, if this thing escalates, because Iran is going to do something, I don't know what, they're probably going to try and thread the needle so that they don't draw the U.S. in, but they can't go too small either, or they won't be able to placate their own hardliners in their own countries. So something's going to happen. And if Israel chooses to use that to then say, oh, now we have to do this. And so they escalate it further by striking into Israel, into Iran. Now then you have the potential that we could get sucked into it whether we want to or not. And all of our troops there would be vulnerable. That's my problem. We should get those guys out of there because we have our own national interests. And just doing whatever Netanyahu says is not one of our national interests, I don't think.
Yeah, you've nailed it. You put your finger right on the button there, which is if we are in any way, shape, or form used by either side, either proxy, to escalate the current crisis, we're the ones who are deficient in leadership. Let's go ahead, take the advantage of position. We can geographically move our troops, station them in hardened positions, vessels. We have a Navy for that. We can move them into hardened facilities so they're not sitting on forward operating bases with the scant, defense systems. When the 3 soldiers were shot in Jordan, it was 4 and 5 years ago, I think, that we removed our Patriot missile defense system from that location. Why did we remove those? Because we felt that we didn't have a strategic threat. Well, we do, and we paid the price for it. Let's stop paying the price. Let's get on the front side of this. The United States is all about tactical advantage and strategic advantage. It is not advantageous when soldiers are operating forward operating bases in the middle of hostile forces, unless you've got something we just haven't heard. And this is absolutely necessary because it opens a corridor for X, Y, and Z. We're not hearing that. So it's time to make a change, and it's time that the administration can take advantage of the chaos on the ground by putting the United States in a position of security first, posture the United States for security and sovereignty, figure out how we do that first, and then let's worry about how do we then press on both parties, whether it's Hamas or whether it's the state of Israel, press on them both to get to the table. They're headed to Cairo to do talks this week, but the talks are not going to be successful because right now the demands of Hamas are complete withdrawal. Everybody gets resettled, and Israel, pulls out. Well, it's interesting, but Israel's not ready to do that yet because they have not eradicated Hamas. So those talks cannot be fruitful until both parties actually come away with something. And right now, you've got parties that are locked in, headstrong against each other. So the United States needs to get out of
this. You've got Hamas wanting everything, and you've got Israel wanting everything, and neither one of them are going to get everything. But so far, they're both in the maximalist position, which means, it's a complete waste of time. But that I think that underscores what you said a second ago about really American interests are not identical with Israeli interest. And so we should not just continue to give Israel everything that Netanyahu is asking for if the end result of that is going to harm our own national security. So whether it's withdraw the troops from Iraq and Syria out of those vulnerable places into hardened areas where we actually have the ability to defend our troops and keep them out of unnecessary harm's way, or it's to say, hey, I'm not going to give you all this ammunition and missiles and everything else if you're going to go out there and start a war with Iran. That's not in our interest, and I'm not going to support that. One or the other, we have to do something. But so far, I haven't seen the White House do either.
Yeah, well, and, we've gotten ourselves here because we've been saying and playing this game for a while that all other people's interest is ours. Look at what's happening in Ukraine on the ground with Russia versus Ukraine. We have made that a strategic, let's call it a watchword for democracy. Somehow, if Ukraine, and this is not to weigh in on whether it should, would, or could, but the idea that we have stated that the Ukraine holding Russia or beating Russia or reclaiming territory will be the end or the beginning of democracy is ridiculous. So the lunacy behind that type of discussion then puts us in the same position where we're now talking about Israel and Hamas or Gaza, which is that once again, the American people are treated to this idea that if we don't do this, democracy at large will be threatened, when in fact we think that there's something else. The idea of a constitutional republic and our participatory vote and our system means, look, it's time for Americans to get out and vote. You've got to go and flex your voice because that's the only product we have that can influence our leadership to say, listen, we believe in America. We're not sure what's happening in Ukraine. We're not sure about Russia. We don't know about Israel. We don't know about Hamas and Gaza. But here's what we do know. Our national sovereignty is important. Our border is important. Our men and women who are serving our country are important. So let's get leaders who talk in the form of first protect our interest and then begin to weigh in and put pressure on economic sanctions, whatever you want, short of war, to influence the other nations. And that's why if we don't vote in these elections, these knuckleheads, up on Capitol Hill will continue to write these blank checks and pretend that everybody in the world's problem is ours first, but that's not the case.
And that, there's such a great example of that over the weekend by Jack Keane, who again seems to be more focused on Netanyahu's needs than he does on America's needs when he said this.
I really think behind the motivation of the president and his team is they really want the fighting to stop. They're not saying that, but I think that's the implication of it. And that, if that happens, underscore what you just said. Because if you leave multiple battalions effective in Gaza and most of the leaders effective in Gaza and the war terminates on those conditions, Hamas wins militarily in the long run. Why? Because they are effective enough to reattack at some point.
See, he's not even talking about what we should do for our national interests. He's basically saying what's wrong with Biden because he's not doing everything that he's told. And that's not in America's interest, as you keep pointing out here. And that, one of the reasons we keep putting this up there is to call it out and to hold people accountable for this stuff. You want to say this stuff, well, we're going to expose that this is not America's interest. This is not helping our country. This is helping somebody else, which ironically won't help them either. I want to point that out.
Well, that's the other thing, Colonel Davis. We don't need to infantilize Israel, the state of Israel, or even Palestine. We don't need to deign to know what is the best interest for them or weigh in on that. That's their decision. They're a sovereign nation state. And what we can do is step back a little bit, get our hands off it and say, listen, we understand, General Keane may be right that if you don't eradicate Hamas, there will be ongoing attacks and threats. We would say the same thing about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban. We've said the same thing. The point is, that shouldn't be our first concern. That's not the cause of America. And so they're mature. Israel will conduct their activities the way they see fit. And if it doesn't work for them, they'll pay the price. Same thing with Gaza, same thing with Hamas. They're going to take actions that are in their best interest. I'm only recommending that we can analyze it a little bit. We can talk about how the tactics work at the soldier level. But veterans like myself who have served in our wars and like yourself, we actually know how tough this is. So let's get off the seat of trying to tell others how to manage their own difficult crises and manage our own first so that we can sit back and say, we've protected our troops, here's some thoughts, and then put the pressure on. But it's diplomatic pressure, it's economic pressure. It's not, we don't need to be all in for everybody's cause at the end of every day.
Well, yeah, that's kind of, I think we're in agreement on there is that I just want to see us worry about what we can control and what is in our best interest. I don't want to just say whatever is in Ukraine's best interest, whatever is in Tel Aviv's best interest. That's what we're going to do what's in our best interest. And if that means helping in certain areas and it makes sense, you could draw a line, as you said a minute ago, then that's valid. Let's give that some thought. But let's jettison any calculation of American interest in lieu of someone else's with our assets that could draw us into a war. That's where I'm way out.
And just as important, Colonel Davis, I know you know this too, is when the politicians and pundits talk about our interest, it is not sufficient to put a platitude up there and say, this is for democracy or this is in our interest. That cannot stand for our actual interest politically or economically. In other words, the voter cannot just go away hearing that we've saved democracy, because that's going to be a pundit or a politician manipulating the language. Explain what you mean. Explain to me why when the Donbass sits in the province or under the authority of Russia in Moscow, tell me why democracy in Wisconsin doesn't work. I'm just interested. And if you can do that, show us the linkage. Okay, fine. But what the American audience has to do is we cannot allow for the language to be so general that everybody's, red straw or red herring argument works to jeopardize our own forces, to jeopardize our own economy.
Right, exactly. And in the last few minutes we have here, especially as we're just really sitting with and anxiously waiting to see what Iran is going to do in retaliation for their embassy being attacked, what would you suggest that the U.S. do in either if it's something medium or even something big, as long as Iran doesn't attack American forces, that would be a different calculation. But if Iran just goes after something Israeli, what do you think the U.S. should do to prevent this from escalating and us getting drawn into a war?
A little bit like we've talked about this before, some of the range of tools in the arsenal of the United States system includes, let's call them Iranian warfare mechanisms, cyber, economic, those type of things. So, for example, when the Houthi rebels were shooting our ships in the Red Sea and attacking commerce vessels, the United States launched some, let's just call them, they launched some less than war attacks against the nation state of Iran, which helped disable some of their functioning assets that were negotiating those attacks. So they know our capabilities. It's pretty clear that we've spoken to them on this and given them the heads up, like, as you continue your warfare, we'll ratchet up ours. They need to know that. And that's how the United States applies pressure below the threshold of war. And we did that in conjunction with attack. So it's not to say that you always separate the two, but you have multiple tools. You've got to use them. That's what statecraft is about. That's what diplomacy is about. And all these guys are talking on the back channels. That's why you see folks picking up the phone or hear about it. And that's why we saw when Iran said, hey, we're going to slow down our Shia forces in Iraq. We're not going to attack you anymore. That's a result of that backside pressure. Yeah. So we have to continue that.
Yeah, well, I'm all for that. I mean, I've always been. I think we've used the diplomatic tool, the non-lethal one, far too infrequently to our demise. But yeah, I want to see that continue on. Well, we'll continue keeping an eye on this. Jason, thanks so much for coming on and giving us this great expertise today and your analysis. And as things continue to develop, we'll keep talking about this and figuring out whatever's next.
It's always a good day when Colonel Davis calls you, but it doesn't mean it's always a good day.
Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that is kind of bad on that. But I'm glad we have you to be able to talk about this and to provide some clarity for our viewers that, here's the real issue. Sometimes you get like, whether it's Kirby or some of these others, they want to give you the platitudes, but we give you the truth. And so we're going to continue to do that. Thanks so much for joining us today. Please come back at 3:00 this afternoon where Doug McGregor is going to talk about some blunt truth in the Ukraine war with some of these probably same concepts. You're not going to want to miss that. Be sure and like and subscribe and share this with all of your friends. It makes liking and subscribing and sharing this video means more than you may think. Then it helps expand the reach that we have so other people get to hear this truth too, because you're not getting this in many of the other mainline forums. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.